Is also going to talk about London, but from the point of view of how local government has developed. This may seem quite a dry topic, but in 2003 he wrote a book about the politics of London, and the subtitle was Governing an Ungovernable City. I wonder if he still thinks that London is ungovernable. It is certainly a wonderful city to live in, if you are lucky enough to have a home. But we all know how many social problems there are for the Mayor of London and the 32 boroughs to sort out, not to mention this strange anomaly of the City of London. There is no better person to navigate us through the complex politics of this city than Professor Tony Travers. He is a visiting professor in the London School of Economics, Department of Government, and the director of a research group called LSE London, which is devoted to researching and reporting on the economic and social issues of the London region. Professor Travers, we look forward to your talk.
First, it's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to come and talk. And what I will do, I'm not making particularly clunking noises about this, is to speak for about, is there any way of sort of slightly reducing?
You can bring it down a little bit. Yeah.
Breaking it down like that. Is that a bit better? Oh, right. That is on. Okay,
we're going to do something different if you allow me.
I see, I've used the handheld one, yes, that's probably better. That's better. Yes, that is better, isn't it? Better for you, better for me. Well, as I was saying, thank you very much for inviting me this morning, and I am indeed going to talk about how London's government has evolved. May not sound the most scintillating question, but here we are actually standing in a spot was the part of the origins of today's London government, as has already by indirectly been made. So I'm going to begin just by making one or two obvious points about how London's evolution explains its contemporary government. It's not a unique issue to London, this. The fact is that in most cities around the world, most cities around the UK, their development as places, industrial or as places to live or both, explains to some extent the way they're governed today. So it'd be true of Manchester, Birmingham, wherever. But I'm going to talk about London. So we all know, children know, London grew from a small settlement on the site of today's city of London, already been mentioned. City, of course, was settled by the Romans, the narrowest point they could cross the river, very differently configured river in those days, and indeed settled in Londinium, as they called it, and at the point where the Guildhall is today. In fact, Guildhall Yard, I was there yesterday, has the Roman amphitheatre marked out in stone. Many of you may have seen that. But of course, a gradual sprawl, all cities sprawl. London sprawled a very, very long way. You know, here we are in Islington, and there's another, 12 or 13 miles worth of London if you go directly north, and if you go south 25 miles from here, urban settlement. And the city's size and importance made a single unit seem too big and powerful. Often the fact that it's the capital city, and Whitehall and Westminster here mean that national politicians have often thought London government's just a bit too powerful, potentially a bit too big and powerful. And of course, the other thing we have to note whenever we're talking about London's government is the City of London has defended its boundaries. Now, Islington obviously has a boundary with the city down the south of the borough, but that city boundary has been defended by the city, as we'll see, for a very, very long time. And its defence of itself as a self-governing unit, for and of itself, has created or helped create the particular version of government in London today. It's very unusual to have this sort of bottom-heavy two-tier system where the boroughs are the primary unit of government and the GLA, GLC before it are actually less powerful than the boroughs are collective. That's very unusual by international standards, and it all stems from the city. The other thing about London is ad hoc arrangements grew up in the wider area around the city as the city grew, based on parishes, this is one, but with parliamentary efforts from time to time to regularise the system and to make it more efficient. So, as I say, 2,000 years old, long evolved history. It's not as old as Rome, it's about as old as Paris, it's a very old city, not as old as Athens, but a very old city. It's seen periods of success and failure, growth and contraction, plague, in the 13th and 14th century, Great Fire, and all of that. There's been migration, both domestic and international, throughout this long period. It's always attracted people from the rest of the country and from the rest of the world, particularly, of course, being a major docking centre for many, many years. And it has been England, not to say the United Kingdom's dominant city, not always the capital, but dominant city for around 2,000 years, aiming off for the period, the Anglo-Saxon period, where nobody really knows what was going on. So, as I say, established by the Romans, where they found a place they could cross the river. They could also access the sea. This is still true. The Thames has a huge range of high and low tides, very much bigger than almost any other city in the world. It's been the centre of government, both national and local, for a very long period. It succeeded Colchester, actually, as the capital of England, and here every now and again kings and queens would try to live other than in London, it never worked. When the Romans were here, it had a population of about 60,000, which was very, very big by the standards of the time, but nowhere as big as Rome itself, capital of their empire, with 1 million people in it, an unimaginable thing these days, 2,000 years ago. And as we know, it was abandoned by Rome after 410 AD, and Anglicised Roman, or Anglicised Britain lived on for about 40 years after that, and then destruction. And we don't know. Go to the British Museum, as many of you do, and we know very little about this period other than what archaeology has told us. So it's a sort of blank period in history within Britain and, of course, within London. So here's where the Romans, there's a map of Roman London, not the most exciting map, but it is a map of Roman London. And you can see it's bordered on one side by the river, and then with these gates, which still have Moorgate, Old Gate. These are actually later names, but so a space which is slightly smaller than the city today, marking the city out as early as the Romans being here. After the period of darkness and the history is missing, after 410 or 450 AD, London is re-established by the Saxons as their city of London Wick, to the west of Roman London. Indeed, I work at the LSE, and the Aldwych, which you all know, is where the Romans settled their version of London initially. And good King Alfred, he was a good king, much known by, or used to be known by school children, perhaps rather less so than these days, but the creator of England, creator of many things, he was a liberal monarch, a liberal head of state, took control of the old walled city of London after 880 because it was safer. They moved from Aldwych down back to the original Roman city because the Roman walls were still there, and that's made it easier for the Anglo-Saxons to keep out marauding Vikings who would turn up from time to time. And Alfred not only resettled the Roman city, but actually begins a form of governance for the city which has even today echoes in the way the City of London governs itself. So concepts like the Court of Husting and Alderman came into existence at this point, and those words, or words like them, are still used in the city today. So here we have Anglo-Saxon London, with visible streets that are still visibly recognisable today. And of course that continues until, and this is history at speed, the arrival of William of Normandy, 1066 and all of that, who conquered England, though as they say in the city, not the city, from which in a moment, in 1066. And when he arrived in London, after winning the Battle of Hastings, had to decide what to do with this self-governing entity, because the city already has its own self-government, merchants and guilds. We all know about the merchants and guilds in the city, and very defensive of its powers and its capacity to govern itself. So he did a deal really with the city. He gave it a royal charter of self-government. And in fact, I think we've got a picture of the charter. There it is. The city still has this. And you can just about read it, even though it's written in an earlier version of English. And what it is effectively doing is guaranteeing the city a degree of independence. But of course, he also, not that certain about the city, built the Tower of London just outside. The Tower of London is still today in Tower Hamlets, it's not in the city. And he built it there to keep a beady eye on this merchant-filled, tax-producing city that he'd given this chartered freedom to. And we know about Lord Mayors of London, there's still a thing, first one in 1189. And the city actually created, long before Parliament did, a form of, you couldn't call it democratic by today's standards, but based on the guilds, people voting, decision-making in a Court of Common Council, became the Court of Common Council, and that system, with elections by wards, which started in 1384, continues today. If you walk past the equivalent churches to this in the city, you'll often see outside them who the ward councillors are. So, in some ways, although we think of the city, and it is an antique institution with particular kinds of heraldry and tradition of pageantry, it actually was quite a democratic place compared with the rest of England at this point, for a long time to come. So here we have England at 1300, there's a very good book written about England at this period by the historian Caroline Barron. It's a very, very good book, very detailed. And of course, we're still here, broadly with the Roman city, the towers there, and we're beginning to see a bit of sprawl along the Strand. It's called the Strand for a good reason, because down here, Edward the Confessor, making a separate decision, effectively established St Margaret's, Westminster and the Abbey at that point, for all time creating a split between the city as a place of commerce, looks like that today, really does look like that today, and Westminster, along the Strand, as a place of religion and state power. That split is still there, you can walk it any day of the week. So the city grew, sort of slightly, not consistently, partly because of plague and bad things happening from time to time. But it began not only to grow in population terms, but to grow geographically. So by 1600, when Queen Elizabeth I, it was a much larger city, and it had extended well beyond the city walls. So famously to Southwark, so there's a ward of Southwark without, which the city has from time to time run, never allowed it to vote for its own ward council, mind you, but it has run it. Southwark was a place of fun. To put it delicately, I won't explain why. It belonged to the Bishop of Winchester, who allowed practices there, which all I can say would make today's Soho, or even yesterday's Soho, seem temperate and modest by standards of the rest of the city at the time. So, finally in Westminster, commerce in the city and government at Westminster, a sort of three-way split. And Elizabeth I tried to stop London growing. She attempted a green belt by taxing development outside the ancient city of London. It didn't work. So by 1600, this is what Elizabeth was trying to hem in. You can see the shape of the city very clearly still there, but now all the Strand is built up, and we're beginning to see growth into Finsbury. So South Islington is beginning to see a bit of growth by this period. You can see why from this map why we all love maps. I go and look at London maps and world maps and other British maps in shops in central London regularly, and these are unconscionably beautiful things. After the fire in 1666, Sir Christopher Wren attempted, with the monarch's agreement, to build this, which would have been to replace the tangled Saxon, to some extent Roman streets, with something that looks as if it was Paris or New York. So with the system of piazza, very foreign-sounding idea, I suspect, at the time, and straight streets and a grid system. Of course, this wasn't built because even with the king's authority behind the attempt to do this, the people who worked and lived in the city just rebuilt it on the old street pattern and, carried on before. Though they did introduce, you'll be happy to hear, higher fire standards. That was one of the Great Fire of London. Virtually nobody was hurt in the Great Fire of London, but it did lead to an enormous leap in terms of building safety and building standards. So we can be thankful for that. Leap forward again to 1750, and now we're in something that increasingly recognisable as a bigger city. So still see the City of London picked out there, but now we've got growth up here into Clerkenwell, Clerkenwell, Farringdon, South Islington as it will be today. Here, what would be today's Holborn, now part of Camden, of course, and into what would today be South Hackney as well. So the beginning of the growth of the city into distinct areas, much of it driven, as we know, not by some great plan, but by aristocrats or businesses, just building property out into open countryside, as it then was. So, of course, at that time, where we are today, and all of this was in the county of Middlesex. It was not in London at all, it was run as part of the county of Middlesex. This is what Islington was like in 1745. So not much in Islington. This is Upper Street, and you can see the street pattern here that's more or less still here today. But there's some growth here, some just on either side of the street, but it's definitely a small area, a small urban area with a church, which of course, and I'll say this in a moment so before we get there. So Islington, a bit like St Pancras next door, became a civil parish within the county of Middlesex, and so it was parish, church parish, but then assumed some administrative responsibilities, as did its neighbour St Pancras, in this large, almost entirely rural area north of the growing London to the south. And of course, this civil parish, which took on some limited government responsibilities, was eventually given a seat at the board of the Metropolitan Board of Works, London's first effort at a citywide authority to deliver infrastructure. And I took this photograph off the internet. Somewhere out there, as you may know where it is, there is a street, it's a sort of street plate for the vestry of St Mary Islington. So this is a piece of early local government. In the south of the borough, Finsbury was formed from areas administered by a number of parishes which were grouped together partly into the Holborn District Board of Works, now in Camden, Clerkenwell Vestry and St Luke's Vestry, which is the one on Old Street. And they were also represented on the Board of Works. So as parishes, as the basic units of what became the metropolitan boroughs, which then were joined together to become the London Borough of Islington, so parishes were hugely important, parish vestries, as the early units of London's government. So by 1860, at the time that you can now see, here's the city, hopefully still there, but we've got very significant growth, more actually up in this direction than into St Pancras. St Pancras, of course, by this time was being blighted by the building of railway stations. St Marylebone over here kept the railway stations out. St Marylebone was a well-run parish with, how shall I put it, more conservative but more organised government. They kept the mainline railway stations out, which means that old St Pancras, and therefore Camden today, has three of them. It's got Euston, St Pancras and King's Cross, all cutting through the old towns of St Pancras and Somers Town and so on. So, not a lot more growth by this point. There was still a tiny fragment of today's Greater London, as we'll see in a moment. So this is what this area had become by 1890, a little bit later. So it's now continuously built up around Upper Street. This is Liverpool Road, Pentonville Road and City Road. So a pattern of development which is still recognisable out here today, based on that earlier street pattern. but now with a clear need, because of all this housing and business, for proper government. And we're now at a point where the growth of the city's population, its need for infrastructure, partly satisfied by the Metropolitan Board of Works, of which I'll say more in a moment, is clearly visible. But the city continued to defend its boundaries. Royal commissions during the 19th century, parliamentary inquiries looked at how London should be governed, and every single time the city and its lobbyists fought off reform. So this wider London area Parliament had to find other solutions that kept the city happy, but also dealt with the fact that London had become a much bigger thing than the City of London. And it was predictably the need for sewers and roads that led Parliament to create a very, very British institution. If you're looking for an example of how the constitution-free, flexible version of British development works, the Board of Works, the Metropolitan Board of Works is it, which was a joint committee of all of these parishes, some of them grouped together into district boards, which had a slightly ramshackle second-order democracy, but it did, crucially, manage to deliver sewers. The whole sewage system in London today was built by the Board of Works, and it's an amazing thing, driven by gravity. It used gravity, like green, long before environmentalism as such had been thought about. It built such few straight roads there are in London, the Board of Works. It built bridges. It eventually created the fire brigade. And, of course, its chief engineer, Sir Joseph Bazalgette, looks very much like a Victorian engineer, is a remarkable person because he is the nearest London had to Haussmann, Baron Haussmann in Paris, laying out the city. He had to work in a very different environment, much more in a very British way, sort of as a senior engineer, managed to get things done that probably politicians couldn't have done. He was obviously a very talented person. Of course, his great-grandson, I think, Peter Bazalgette, is out there in public life. You'll see him as sort of TV and cultural figure, TV sort of television producer and things, or maker of programmes. Anyway, the London County Council succeeded the Board of Works. The Board of Works was still there at the time when the rest of England was seeing its local government reformed, and a county council was created in London to match those that were being created elsewhere. So this is the beginning of modern government as we know it, a directly elected county council. In fact, the school board, the London School Board, had preceded it. Interestingly, the London School Board was the first institution other than the City of London to have London in its name. Because of the city's refusal, and the city being London, Metropolitan Police, Metropolitan, Metropolitan Board of Works, Metropolitan, so as not to use the word London. School Board was the first one, London County Council was second. And the County Council was the city's first directly elected citywide municipal authority, and within it, 28 metropolitan boroughs were created, one of which was, of course, the Metropolitan Borough of Finsbury, another the Metropolitan Borough of Islington. Islington became, I think, the most populous of them all. It was an incredibly densely populated place. And they were created to cover the whole of the LCC area. So this is today's inner London. The inner London boroughs today were covered by this area, and the LCC proved powerful and effective. So here's the inner London area with, here we've got Islington, Finsbury, Stoke Newington, of course, up here, now part of Hackney, St Pancras and Holborn on the other side. So this is a series of names. A colleague of mine made the point, these are the names that you're more likely to see on road signs and street signs, directional signs, than the contemporary boroughs. Now in Islington has the name of one of its constituents, but actually you'll see lots of references in London to these names, more than in some cases the boroughs, the same with the borough name today. By 1900, Britain was the height of empire. London had become the biggest city the world has ever known, bigger than any city in history, and Parliament, the London docks, the City of London, the fashionable West End, all attested to the city's power and might. But there was a massive difference between the West End and the East End. And the West End
These are just two drawings from the time. Gustave Doré, many of you will know him, a great chronicler of London at the time, creating fabulous images of light and dark, just using pencil effect or charcoal. And here we've got Chesterfield House in Mayfair. Now I don't need to say to anybody in this room, this divide is always there. It may not be quite East End, West End in the same way it was, but this difference between London as a home of the sumptuously rich and wealthy and London as a home of the poorest people in the United Kingdom is true today as it was then. But now we're in the kind of modern London. Now the great leap out from the LCC area. So the LCC was created in 1889, the Metropolitan Boroughs in 1900, and that looked as if it was London. There were sort of 4.5–5 million people living in this area, 4.7 it says here, so let's go for that. But between 1888 and 1939, it jumps, particularly after the First World War, to 8.6 million. So this is a huge, huge increase, obviously. The London County Council, very progressive, would be seen as left-wing today, developed social housing, schools, transferred from the school board, hospitals, tramways, bridges. It was an amazingly powerful municipal institution. And alongside it, the buses in the Underground were created into another massively important institution, the London Passenger Transport Board, bringing together the loss-making Underground, can you believe it, and the very profitable buses into a combine, which was the origins of London Transport, and therefore TfL. And of course that created an enormous impetus, particularly because of its very business-like chairman, as he would have been, Lord Ashfield, who wanted to build out into the suburbs to generate ever more people to use the buses and tubes. So here are two major figures. I'm sorry, there are some men in this presentation, but that's history for you. Herbert Morrison, many of you will remember Herbert, may actually remember one or two in the room, but certainly of him. Herbert Morrison, the legendary leader of the LCC, also in Churchill's wartime cabinet, the leading Labour member of the wartime cabinet. And over there, Lord Ashfield, a remarkable person, Lord Ashfield, grew up in a tiny house in Derby, poor as a church mouse, went to America, became successful, ran streetcars in Detroit and New Jersey, then came back to create the combine that became London Transport, and then a sort of rather plutocratic conservative ran the London Passenger Transport Board, which became London Transport. These people, polar opposites, fought politically, but respected each other as well. So when Ashfield died, Morrison went to his funeral and was highly complimentary of him. There's an LCC tram and LCC housing. You can see that today in the Boundary Estate down on the, I think it's on the city, it's not really on the city Tower Hamlets board, but very near South Islington and South Hackney besides. Arnold Circus is a remarkable example of how slums were removed and in their place model housing for the poor was built, and it's still there and it's still pretty good. On the other side of there's two powerful individuals, the iconography of Ashfield and Pitt, so Lord Ashfield the chair, Frank Pitt the more famous in many ways, chief executive of London Transport, who created both the tube map, actually Harry Beck created the tube map, which is now possibly the most copied thing of its kind in the world, the roundel and the typeface. This typeface, I mean, I'm just amazed, this typeface, Johnston typeface, is now over 100 years old, and yet it's still used and it still looks modern. There aren't many things that were seen as modern 100 years ago that still look as if they're contemporary, and that tells us something about design. And of course, they were also, Pick in particular, promoters of good architecture. That's a very Scandinavian-looking station at the northern end of the Piccadilly line. So they were remarkable people all. Anybody know where this is? Very good. Moscow themed. It's based on the Moscow Metro, and it looks like the Moscow Metro. Anybody know where this one is? It's Mile End. That's based on a New York subway station. They were designed in this way to mimic. This is how much they thought about what they were doing, these people. So this map shows you the great growth. So The LCC time is this white to yellow area in the middle, and yet by the Second World War, London's grown into all of this, and that of course prompts the demands for need for what would today be seen as the Green Belt, which the LCC promoted to stop London. Well, if it had carried on like this, it would have met Birmingham at some point, and vice versa, like Tokyo and Yokohama. So this meant that by 1939, 2/3 of the built-up area of Greater London, and it was called Greater London by then, was outside the LCC boundaries. And that led to pressure, particularly from my academic predecessors, to develop a new London government to cover a much bigger 1,500 square kilometre, 620 square mile area of this huge built-up city. And in the 1960s, the Royal Commission proposed a new Greater London Council with a second tier of boroughs, bigger boroughs than the previous ones, and that reform took place in 1965. As ever, the city survived. So here we can see the LCC area picked out in white. So it's Islington, where Islington and Finsbury are brought together into the new borough of Islington. But these areas outside the LCC in Middlesex and Surrey and Kent are brought into the new Greater London area. And this is the system with that boundary that has lived on now amazingly for 60 years. After the war, London, I must speed up, mustn't I? London went into decline, the population started to fall. I mean, that was partly because of, during the war, children and some mothers moving out of the city, but it was more than that, partly because of not just people moving out because of the railway allowing them to move further away, but secondly, as London started to deindustrialise, the transport system was underinvested after it was nationalised in 1947-48, and this led to an enormous hollowing out of inner London. So it's, boroughs like Tower Hamlets, their population had been 500,000, they fell to 150,000, because today Tower Hamlets is back heading towards 400,000 again. So it's a remarkable, and something similar will have happened in Islington. And of course, in the 1950s and 60s, well-intentioned policies to deliver new housing post-war, particularly social housing, created new problems, i.e. new forms of housing that didn't work as well as their originators might have hoped. And of course we know that the intellectual and political battle between the GLC as led by Ken Livingstone and Mrs Thatcher as Prime Minister led to the GLC being abolished only 21 years after it had been created. Fast forward from there to today, I mean, paradoxically, almost the day the GLC was abolished in 1986 was the point where London's population reached its post-war nadir, so about 6.6 million, so down 2 million. Many of you will remember 1980, I think everybody in the room, including me, remembers 1986. If we'd been told in 1986, when the population was 6.6 million, that it was going to grow by 2.5 million by 2025, we'd all thought that was not possible, but that's what's happened. It's a massive revival. The boroughs, who survived GLC abolition, worked together with business and lobbied in some ways to create a new London government, business and boroughs working together to create the new London government we have today. This was the time when financial services were deregulated, massive growth of the industries that were already strong in London, and of course massive migration, even more mass recently, creating a very different version of London to the one that had existed even as recently as 1960. Greater London Authority, created in 2000, Tony Blair, or the presidential Prime Minister, comes up with the idea of an American-style directly elected mayor, which not only he, but the presidential-like David Cameron, who came along later, thought exactly the same thing. They like mayors, we've now got them all over the country increasingly, directly elected, setting policies and budgets and making appointments to boards, overseen by the London Assembly, not a council, but an assembly, different name, differently elected, providing, now, transport, some elements of policing, fire and emergencies, Resources for housing, economic development, citywide planning, very important. Islington has to fit its local plan within the Mayor of London's London plan. So that's what we had. But the boroughs, as I say, if you look at all the boroughs together, they do spend twice as much as the Mayor, more than twice as much actually. So the Mayor, of course, is seen as London's leader. Executive for citywide services, the boroughs continue to run social care, some aspects of education, housing, local planning, local roads, environment and leisure. But of course, this being a rather centralised country, central government still has an enormously important role, most obviously for the healthcare service, the social security, much in the news at the moment, also for other services besides. So what's happened since the 80s? Well, the most obvious thing is that London's hasn't grown out because of the Green Belt, though it does leap over the Green Belt to places like Reading, Basingstoke and so on. But what's really happened is the emergence of major regeneration schemes on ex-industrial sites. So most obviously near to here, King's Cross, most obviously Battersea, Nine Elms, or Stratford, where the Olympics were, now out in West London at Old Oak Common. And of course, this is a completely different version of development, because what we're now doing, what the government's doing is, and the boroughs are doing, is harnessing the private sector and its money to deliver massive redevelopment. So we're no longer having the government spending money on all of this, but the private sector being harnessed by the public sector to deliver. And of course, London's high land values have allowed significant leverage of private investment into these large schemes, with councils and the GLA operating increasingly as development corporations as much as service providers. And this has led to very different aesthetics and densities, which themselves are a product of the city's government system since then. So, you probably can't see this very easily, but this is Greenwich, a view looking down from across the river from Greenwich through the Naval College at the docks in the early 80s, with just the Bunkentine estate here. And now this enormous forest of towers on the other side of the river. And that's all happened in 40 years, slightly less than 40 years. Here we go. I took this picture from the top of one of our buildings at the school, just to make the point that the city has policies that actively encourage the building of skyscrapers, and they're building many more as we speak. Whereas Westminster, this is the same view on the same day the other way, has more or less kept all of them out. And in fact, Camden and Islington have similar policies. Islington, I think, under one administration allowed a few down the very south of the borough. Hackney's allowed a few in the south of the borough. But mostly, and the point I'm making here is borough government matters, because you can end up with these completely different skylines simply because they're run by different politicians. And we're getting more and more of this. Lewisham Town Centre on the left, North Acton, Manhattan comes to North Acton on the right, and anybody been to Wembley recently? Massively dense housing being built around Wembley Stadium, or just around Wembley Stadium and Wembley Park. Very good, 24-storey buildings in long lines, like toast tracks. And this one over here, Ilford, in outer London, is now getting in. So we've got, the point I'm making here is you don't really see this kind of thing in Paris or New York or other analogous cities, because the government of London is all the major planning authorities. There's 33 of them, and therefore they can make their own decisions about this. If they want tall buildings, they can have them. If they don't, they can avoid them. So it's had an impact on almost all aspects of our lives, including the physical structure. This is impossible to see. It's an attempt at a simplified version of the London government system. Usually, if you can read it, you get a bit of a laugh, because you've got the GLA in the middle here, the boroughs here, government departments with responsibilities for London here, and then dozens and dozens of institutions which have some form of executive responsibility for delivering services in London. Now, all cities would have something like this, but it is a very, very, very complex and sophisticated system of government, albeit now for a city of 9 million people. So what can we conclude from all of this? Well, there's been regular reforms, regular in the great scheme of history, and regularly compared with, say, Paris or even New York. Regular reforms, search for improvement, London's government system, with always resistance from the pre-existing system. So if anybody proposed now reforming London's government, Islington Council, Camden Council, the city would all oppose it, almost certainly, because they want to keep the system they've got now. It's a natural human response. There was a lot of that in 1963-45 when this system was being created. Reforms, when they happen, tend to be slow and driven by problems. So sewers, the need for sewers, drove the creation of the Metropolitan Board of Works. Fragmented government and poor public health led to the creation of metropolitan boroughs and more powerful boroughs in the late 19th century. At all times, we have this struggle between metropolitan interests, i.e. all our, as people living in a large city, and neighbourhood interests. The most obvious being, everybody wants to have a tube station near where they live, but they don't want it outside their front door. So we all want things that are sort of good for us, but not too close to us. So, and of course the City of London is the ultimate example of that. It's managed to maintain its self-government system, neighbourhood government, just over a square mile for the better part of 1,000 years. But the other boroughs have similar views, and actually the other boroughs in the city get on very well. They have similar interests because the thing they have in common is that whichever political party or none they're run by, they all have a vested interest in being able to do what they want themselves in their own way. And so they'll defend all the others, whatever they do, to defend themselves. And that's a very powerful, it leads to a sort of rules-based relationship between the boroughs, which get on strangely well, one might say. There's always a challenge of planning and service delivery across such a large area. You're sitting in City Hall, in the Royal Docks, trying to envisage what your planning policies will do for areas as different as Uxbridge, Romford, Coulsdon and Mill Hill. It's a very large area to think about. And of course, as I said earlier on, we have always to remember London is both a capital city and a civic entity. It's a place, 9 million people, huge economy, mayor, boroughs, but it is also the capital city of the country, and that tension is a real one. The relationship between London and central government under the Labour government today is about as good, i.e. not brilliantly good, as it was under Lord Salisbury in the 1890s and 1900s. Not good then either. So, population now reached 9 million. It's, according to projections from the ONS, going to reach 9.5 million in the middle of the next decade, and then 10 million at the end of the next decade. So, nowhere near as big as some cities in other parts of the world these days, but still, a remarkably large and highly efficient city. Very efficient in terms of, if you look at the amount of economic output that's produced in London relative to the amount of travel people do in cars, it's very, very high. It's a very efficient place in terms of GDP per amount of energy used. So what can we conclude? Well, we know this. London faces continuous change and government reform for the obvious reason it never settles, it never sleeps, it never stops. It's all new people arriving at scale. I mean, London now is a city where nearly half the population was born outside the United Kingdom. Way out higher than New York. Think about that. New York 36%, London 47-48%. So an incredibly lots of people moving in, moving out all the time. Despite periods of up and down in government reform, the city appears to develop regardless. It's got this very large economy with lots of overlapping different economies which self-generate and produce what my economist colleagues would call agglomeration benefits at scale. It has periods of strength and periods of decline, but we've seen since 1985 the emergence of a sort of global, rather glossy global version of London. And of course within that, the mayor is a radical change, giving enormous power and visibility to its office holder, and producing a sort of paradox really, that it's got a complex government system and a complex tangle of people over this vast area, and yet compared with the rest of the country, over time, very strong economic growth. Just a reminder, I didn't mean to tell you this, that London sits inside a massive region. So 9 million people in London, but 23 million in this wider region, which again, there's only two places anything like that in terms of population growth in the world. They are the 17-county New York, New Jersey region and the Tokyo-Yokohama super region. Even Paris and the Ile-de-France are not as large or as economically, don't have an economy on the scale of all of this. And they are all part of one place because, you know, loads of people who work in London travel in, you know, from all the way through this area. So it's, in some ways, economic geographers would see this as London rather than the administrative Londons I've been talking about. And I said global London, I mean, this is a slightly sun-kissed image, it's a sort of mixture of vast global cities, skyscrapers, slightly ominous smog there, which, given that London's air is of a much better quality today than it's been for probably 200 years. But I mean, so it's both this London, but the London of the 19th and 18th centuries and outer suburbs which are very different from it. So thank you for listening. And if you like, I'm happy to take a few questions, but the chair will run that. So thank you very much.
Well, that was amazing. Okay, I'm going to take questions in threes. Person over there with the white hair. Everyone has white hair here. And then Barry Edwards. And the lady with her hand up, black with a navy blue sleeve, I see. Okay.
Yep. Thank you. Fantastic. It's so exciting, so interesting. I just wondered if you've got views about if you were able to start again with structure.
So views about?
If you were able to start again with the structure of administration.
Yeah. Okay, one question and then Barry. Got that? Where's the other mic?
Okay, got it.
You finished, haven't you?
No, I'd like a sheet of paper. What would you do with that? What structure would you introduce? And could you refer to funding as well at the same time? Funding.
Funding, okay.
Right, we've got Barry over here. Second row, and then four rows back.
Although I'm a third generation Londoner, I'm very well aware that the rest of the United Kingdom is very concerned about the vast power, both commercial and political, that London and the London region has. And therefore you get one thing like the Mayor of Manchester and the other Northern all complaining that they're underdeveloped